So, to recap and kind of review, we are about to have the fulfillment of the first promise to Abraham and the second or the fourth promise to Israel. In the covenant with Abraham, God said, I will make you a great nation. And we said the word nation, goy, means people with land. And there's one of the comments on the book of Joshua, that Joshua repeats the word goy a lot. And there's also some chapters here, I didn't write that on the notes, but you can write it yourself if you want. In the chapters of the division of the land, there is a chapter about old. So all of what God had promised Israel, He had fulfilled. All the lands that He promised their grandparents, He had given them. All the things that He said He will do, He did. So this chapter has this all repeated over and over again in the book of Joshua. Also, the book of Joshua uses the word, like I said, goy, not people anymore. So by them entering the promised land, they become a nation, not just people. So this session, in chapter 9 in our study, is about the conquest of the land and moving from the first promise of Abraham to the second promise. What's the second promise? He says, I'll make your name great. And making his name great is by having a king's royalty. And this will be moving from a goy to a kingdom. And this is the transition. So they're entering the promised land, they're taking hold of the land to become a goy, to become a nation, and then we are going to prepare for the king, for a kingdom, so that they become the kingdom of God. The questions that we're asking, what events happened after the death of Moses? And then we're asking a question, so are the judges? Why we call them this way? Why Ruth is in the genealogy? It's in the genealogy of Christ. You think it's a typo again? Why is she in the genealogy of Christ, Ruth? How did Israel move from judges to monarchy? That's a very key question for today. What are the circumstances of the covenant with the king? What happened that around in starting the covenant with the king of Israel? This session will cover Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel. We start with the first question is, at the end of the life of Moses, what happened? They're prepared to enter the promised land. The whole point of Moses being sent to Egypt to bring the people of God to enter the promised land, take hold of it, and own it and divide it and become their land, and by having this land they become a nation. The name Joshua, which is the book that we are going to find the details of the conquest of the promised land, the name Joshua, which means the Lord is salvation, is in Hebrew Yeshua, in Greek it's Isos, and it's in English, if you translate it properly in English, it will be Jesus. Joshua's original name was Hosea, but Moses changed his name to Joshua. This name change was prophetic, for it made Joshua a type of Jesus Christ. And Moses is the lawgiver, he gives the law, could not bring Israel into the promised land, which shows that the law of Moses cannot save the people, but Joshua brought them in, and in this he was a type of Jesus Christ who brings his own into heaven through grace. That's John Chrysostom in his commentary on, I think, the letter to the Hebrew, and he brings in this typology about Joshua. So this is a unique piece, and the fathers of the church had agreed this is something very prominent, and that Moses had to stop short of entering the promised land because he was not suitable as a lawgiver to enter the promised land. It had to be grace of the New Testament, and St. Paul would confirm that. The book of Joshua is the book, so we talked a little bit about Joshua himself. Let's talk about the book that documented the fulfillment of God's first promise to Abraham, and this is in chapter 12 of Genesis, verse 2, and the fourth promise to Israel. Remember how there were 4 promises, and they commemorate them by 4 cups of wine in the Passover. So the cup number 4 was drunk to commemorate, to remember the 4th promise to Israel, which said, I'll take you to the land that I promised your grandparents. So this book of Joshua document the fulfillment of the promise of God to both Abraham and to his descendants. The book of Joshua divides neatly into 2 principal sections. Section 1, which are chapters 1 to 12, it's 24 chapters. So if you divide the book into equal halves, it will be 12 and 12. 1 to 12, 13 to 24. The 1 to 12 is about the fighting, the conquest, taking over the land. 13 to 24 describe the assignment of tribal territories and the dispersal of the tribes throughout the land of promise. Every tribe goes to their land. When they were in the desert, they were one camp, one group of people, a huge group of people, moving together. But then they entered the promised land, they took over the land as a group of people, and then they divided the land, and each tribe went to its appointed portion. The 2 sections, and a little bit more details, not a lot of details. The first section, which is the conquest of the land, the fighting, it starts with, I'm going to go through the chapters from 1 to 12 or 1 to 10. Choosing Joshua after the death of Moses, and the Lord's promise to be with him as he was with Moses. That's chapter 1. In this chapter, it's a very natural transition from Deuteronomy, the last book of the 5 books of Moses, to this historical book, Joshua. It's a very, very fitting transition because Deuteronomy ends with the death of Moses. Chapter 1 in Joshua starts with the transition of the leadership to Joshua. And God promises, I'll be with you like I was with Moses, and I will make you, I will prove you in the eyes of the people so that they will believe in you as they believed in Moses. So this was very fitting. That's chapter 1. Rahab and the story of spying Jericho. This time they learned the lesson. They didn't send 12 spies. They didn't need to do that. They sent only 2 spies to look at a specific city, that's Jericho. They wanted to look at this city because it was the fairest city in their conquest. Just keep that in mind. Jericho is the fairest city to enter into the promised land. And we'll show you on the map where Jericho is and why it is important that Jericho becomes a very famous city. Here it is. You see, they coming from the plains of Moab, and they cross the Jordan, and then in Gilgal, they do their circumcision. They wait a little bit and they camp. And then they send 2 spies to Jericho. Gilgal is not a city, it's a place. But the first real city with walls is this little town of Jericho. And it had fortification. It was a very special walls. They call those walls, the type of walls they found in the digging, casemate walls. What's a casemate wall? They make a wall and they make the houses between 2 walls to make a house itself, the house itself a fortification. So you have multiple walls and people are living between them to enhance the strength of the walls. But when the attack happened, people in the houses by the wall, they might move inside the city. So Jericho is the first city in their conquest. Who lived in this city was Rahab. Who was Rahab? There is a word used in Hebrew that's a little bit ambiguous. The word can be translated into a hostess, which literally or commonly known as an innkeeper. But it can also mean a harlot, a prostitute. The Jewish rabbis has stayed away from that second understanding because it was a little bit demeaning to call one of their grandmothers a harlot, so they prefer to use an innkeeper or a hostess. So, and that's suitable because when the 2 spies wanted to lodge, they found no place but the house of Rahab, and they stayed there, and she hid them. It was normal that strangers will take refuge in an inn, and the king will be looking for them. So Rahab kept the two spies. She believed in the God of Israel. She was very impressed by the news that she heard about him, and she wanted to be part of the people of God. And she told the spies. And the spies made a covenant. Again, they gave a covenant of peace. They told Rahab, we swear, and they swore by the name of God, of Yahweh, to protect Rahab and her house, as long as she hangs a crimson, a red scarlet thread from her window. So she hid them because her house was in the wall, part of the casemate fortification. She could lower them from the wall to outside the city, and they came back peacefully to their camp. That's chapter 2. Then chapter 3 speaks about the great event of crossing over the Jordan. By crossing the Jordan, it's a landmark. They actually entered the promised land. And when the whole people crossed the Jordan, they understood that God had fulfilled the promise he gave to Abraham. It began by crossing the Jordan. And the Jordan crossing, for generations since this story was told and the Christian church had inherited it, the crossing of the Jordan represented to us Christians ending of this age and beginning the age to come. We're going into our own promised land. The Jordan becomes the territory of that body of water. The water of the Jordan stopped at their right side as they entered, because they're entering from east to west, and the Jordan runs from north to south. So if you're going from east to west, and the water is coming from the north, it's coming on your right side, all of a sudden the water of the Jordan stopped as a wall, which was a smaller version of the Red Sea crossing. In the Red Sea there were two walls, one on the right, one on the left, and the Jordan was only one at the right side. And how did it happen? When you read it in chapter 3, the priest carried the Ark of the Covenant, and then the priest moved ahead of all the congregation, a mile ahead, and they stepped into the water of the Jordan. And the second the soles of the feet of the priest touched the ground of the river, the water stopped. And this consecrated the water of the Jordan forever. When the water stopped, all the people crossed. And then when they crossed and finished crossing, Joshua ordered them to take 12 stones and set them and make almost like the pillars at the foot of Mount Sinai, made them at the bottom of the Jordan as a memorial that Israel had crossed the Jordan in that place. And the place is called Gilgal. So they would do that in chapter 4. They put the stones. And then once all the people left and the stones was erected, the priest with the Ark of the Covenant moved inside the promised land behind the congregation, and the water returned back to its normal course. Joshua encountered the commander of the heavenly army in circumstances similar to Moses encountering the Lord in the burning bush and the preparation for war. When he saw this man standing on his feet, and he looked at him and said, Joshua said, "Are you for us or for our enemies?" He said, "I am the commander of the heavenly army, and I came here to help you prepare for war." And he gave him the instructions that priests should carry the Ark of the Covenant ahead of the people, and every day will do one circle around Jericho. On the seventh day, which is supposed to be the Sabbath, they turn around Jericho 7 times. And at the 7th time, everybody will shout, all the congregation will shout, and the walls will fall, and then they can take the city. And this is exactly what happened. People had kind of argued over who is this figure. Was it Archangel Michael? The Jewish rabbis in the later generations said it was Archangel Michael. The church thinks it was Christ himself. There was certain things in this encounter that said it was the same person of the burning bush, because he was asked, Joshua was asked to take his sandals off, like what happened with Moses. That's chapter 5. They did that, and in chapter 6 we see the fall of Jericho, the victory. And be careful now, the victory was made by priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant, not by soldiers. And here's 2 things. Just let you know this for ahead of time. The fact that the priests carried the Ark of the Covenant into the promised land, stopping the water of the river, and then knocking down the walls of Jericho, it shows that the priests in the kingdom of God are the real force, the real power of the kingdom. If you want to knock down the power of Israel, you start by knocking down the priests. And this is what will happen in the time of Samuel. And we're going to hear about that. From that time on, Israel understood when they want to conquer in a fight, they take the priest, they take the Ark of the Covenant and go forward to make victory. Because Jericho was the first city and was to be consecrated to God as the first fruit of the promised land, God asked them to not keep anything alive and not to take anything from that city. No gold, no silver, no slaves, nothing. Completely burn everything. And if there is something that is non-perishable, like gold or silver or bronze, they will bring it to the tabernacle. Some family had found some very good stuff and it was very precious and they couldn't let go of it. And they took it and they hid it under their tent. I think it's Achan. His name is Achan, the family of Achan. So the consecration was not complete. They went into the second city. Here is the second city. What is the second city after Jericho? And the second city after Jericho is Ai. Because the consecration of Jericho was not complete, they lost their strength. Actually, this Jericho chapter 6, the victory. The second city in chapter 7, Ai, they were defeated. And they were crying. And Joshua said, what happened? What's wrong? And they asked God, and the oracle came saying, because somebody had stolen something from the Jericho. And when they did the Urim and Tamim, like I told you, they ask different questions, yes or no. So they will take tribes, and they say, is it the tribe of Judah? And they pick up the stone, and the stone says, no, the red stone. And then they go into the next tribe, and the next tribe, and next tribe. They spend maybe a day or even two answering questions, one tribe at a time, until the family of Achan, who Joshua asked and said, what have you done? And he was punished for this. They were executed. And so the correction happened by execution. That's chapter 8. And then when the situation was corrected, Ai was taken easy. Now, this again show you that the fight over the promised land, because it's all magic, it's all made on the promise of God. When the person actually departs from the commandments of God, and they start playing around it, and they start doing things that's not supposed to be done, they lose their strength. They lose their victory, because their victory is from God. If they are not with Him, and if they're not obedient, over and over again, they will be defeated. They will lose what God has given them. To show us, as the New Testament people, over and over again, it is not by our own power, or by our own might, or our own effort. Yes, we need to do something, but it's basically by obedience and holiness. Obedience and holiness. In chapter 9, a very interesting incident will happen. A group of people, they are called the Gibeonites from Gibeah. They came over to the people of God while they were in the promised land. They're not coming out of the promised land. They're actually inside the promised land after taking over Ai. And they told them, we are your neighbors. We're coming from a very far country. And we heard about the great victories that your God had done. And we want to make a covenant with you. What does a covenant mean? They're going to have to make them their own kin, their own family. It's like a treaty. They want to have them swear by God they will not fight them. And Joshua very naively, you can say that, and the fathers of the church defended Joshua and the leaders of the tribes came together and said, these people are coming to us, look at them. And they said they were dressed in rags. They have moldy bread in their hand and dry bread. And they are filled, like covered with dust. Said, we've been traveling for a long time. Look at us. We're coming from a very far country. We want to make a treaty. So Joshua and the leaders said, you're not in the middle of the land. You're not amongst us. Said, no, we are not. They lied, of course, to protect themselves, because they knew these people are coming to take the land and kick everybody else out. So the Gibeonites received the promise with a swearing, with an oath, after lying to Joshua. And they swore by God not to do anything for them. But then when they entered the promised land and found them in the center of the promised land, Joshua said, "Why did you do that?" A very interesting question. Of course, because we're afraid for our lives and the life of our kids and families. Joshua said, "Because you have done this," and the leader said, "We cannot go back on the covenant. We're going to make you always the lowest of trades in this. You're going to fill water for us. You're going to be our servants. You're going to be..." And the Gibeonites said, "Do whatever you want. As long as we live, we're fine." Then they start making the wars. And the wars is chapters 10 to 13. Chapters 10 to 13, it was wars. But I want to tell you something about the wars, because some people would say, why would God do this to people? And the first thing we want to know is, this was not favoring Israel over the Canaanites. The Canaanites were actually condemned people. That were what God had said already to Abraham, and we saw this in chapter 15 of Genesis. They had a judgment written about them. They were actually to be executed. And God said in the beginning, "I will take care of that. You don't have to," like in Sodom and Gomorrah. But then when Israel started to do the same things they did, God said, "You will have to do it yourself, so you can actually have a history. What happened to people when they are acting in this abominable way?" The Gibeonites will have a history with us when we come into the book of Samuel. We're going to talk about them again. There was a promise with an oath, a promise with an oath that makes a covenant with the Gibeonites not to be killed or hurt. The second section of Joshua from 13 to 24 is the division of the land, the cities of the refuge. What's the cities of refuge? In summary, it is a place, a city, where when you call it involuntary manslaughter, somebody kills someone by mistake. Like today, when somebody hits someone with a car, there is no intention in doing the murder. They just kill them by mistake. So in that case, for example, someone's oxen run with the horns into somebody's back or belly and they die. So there's a murder. There is a killing, and the oxen killed the man. So if the family of the victim wanted to take revenge on the murderer or his family, the murderer can run to those cities, and if they enter the city, they can stay in that city. And as long as they don't leave that city, the victim's family cannot kill them. When can they leave the city? When the high priest of the time dies. When the high priest dies, they relieve them from that quarantine. So there were cities of refuge scattered all over Israel. And there are also Levitical cities, and these are chapter 13 to 24. What are the Levitical cities? They give the Levites and the priests places to live. They didn't give them a special tribe portion. They just scattered them all over Israel. What is the purpose of that? So they will be teaching Israel holiness. They will be the one to teach Israel the ways of God. So they had to live among them. 2.5 tribes, this is extra piece of information, chose to settle east of the Jordan in the lands of Og, the king of Bashan, and Sihon, the king of the Amorites. Remember, in the time of Moses, they fought those two kings, and you read about them in the second host, or the first host of Tasbeha, the second host. This was the Amorites, and the Bashanites are actually east of the Jordan. If you look at them, here it is. And notice here that Manasseh is a hugest piece of land. Half of it is east of the Jordan. Half of it is west of the Jordan. Gad is east of the Jordan. Reuben is east of the Jordan. Those one tribe, Reuben, two tribes, Gad, half tribe Manasseh, are east of the Jordan. This is the land of Bashan, where the king, his name was Og, and they killed him, and the Israelites in the fight while Moses was still alive. And then the king of Sihon, the king of the Amorites. So the Amorites and the Bashanites were killed or were defeated, and the land was taken by these 2.5 tribes. Although it's a huge half tribe, but still a half tribe. Manasseh was a big, big, big tribe. So these were very good land for shepherds. It was not actually a good land for agriculture, it was for shepherds. And these 2.5 tribes found it very suitable for them, and they wanted to take over them. But Joshua said, okay, you want to take those lands? You have, before we give you those lands and you settle in them, make a promise to go with the rest of the tribes and clean the promised land itself, so that as they helped you in this fight, you help them in their fights. And when they are settled, you can go back and live in this land that you chose. And they agreed. So these 2.5 tribes will always be on the east side of the Jordan. Notice here, the Jordan is running between 2 bodies of water, and the north body of water is a sweet water lake, Sea of Galilee, and the south body of water is very salty, bitter water. That's the saltiest water on earth. It is so salty that if you leave something organic in it, it will disintegrate. There is no living creature in this Dead Sea. So, but the river runs from north to south. Nowadays, there is no water running from north to south anymore. Very little. They are out of water in Israel. So, let me show you where the tribes settled. Okay? This piece here, the Manasseh, Gad, Ephraim, is Samaria in the time of Christ. This piece here is Galilee, where the Sea of Galilee is. So you have Asher, Naphtali, Zebulun, and Issachar. This is Galilee, what we know as Galilee today. And then Dan, Ephraim, Benjamin, and Gad, this is Samaria. And then you go down, and this is Judah, or Judea. That's Judah, a little bit of Benjamin, of course, because Jerusalem there, and then Simeon. How many tribes we have now? Count with me. 1, Asher, 2, Naphtali, Zebulun 3, Issachar 4, Manasseh 5, Gad 6, Reuben 7, Ephraim 8, Dan 9, Benjamin 10, Judah 11, Simeon 12. 12 tribes. Here, Simeon is actually in the belly of Judah. And notice here, this is Kadesh. This is the territory with the plains of Moab. This is Moab. Moab and Edom. When we go to the next book, we have the third part, or the end of the second part, is speeches that Joshua will give to the people after they settle. There were 2 incidents that we need to speak of them quickly. When they settled, Joshua told them, you have to understand that this land was given to you by God according to a covenant. And right now you are in the promised land, but you have to make a choice. Either you want to serve the gods of the land, because they're actually living among Canaanites, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Living among Canaanites. So you can have the choice to serve the gods of the Canaanites or the gods of the Egyptians, or you want to serve Yahweh, who brought you up to this point and had you and given you the land. And if you want, you can serve any other god. That's your choice. But as for me and my house, we will serve Yahweh. And he was very firm about this. And the people said, no, we'll serve Yahweh. We are the servants of Yahweh. He said, you can't. And if you don't do it, you will be in trouble, because he's not going to forgive you. And they said, no, we will do it, we will do it. He said, now today you are witnesses against yourselves that you want to serve God, and beware. And if when I die and I go, you will be turning away from him, and there will be very bad times for you. And they continued to argue and say, no, we will do it, we will do it. Joshua dies, and comes the time, and by the way, Joshua is the first judge, the time of the judges, Who are the judges? And what do they represent for Israel? After the death of Joshua and the settlement of Israel in the Promised Land, the people of God faced the task of cultivating the land. Understand this piece because I want you to understand this. Very good. Being a nomadic shepherds, they were not actually never, even in Egypt, they were not agricultural people. They were not farmers. They were shepherds. They had no knowledge of agricultural life and practices. They're coming to something totally new. They looked to the experts, the Canaanites, who inhabited the land, for guidance. You're going to ask me, weren't they supposed to expel everybody and kill everybody and get this land clear? Yes, but they didn't. They really didn't. They just lived with them. And the Canaanites, in turn, instructed them to use the help of their gods. Their life as farmers was intertwined with the worship of Baal and the Ashtaroth. They were the god and the goddess of fertility and rain. They controlled the land. They controlled the fate of the land and what crops should be, grown and all that stuff. And their worship was in temples scattered all over the land, and that include prostitution as well as, in times, human sacrifices. The Israelites did not drive the Canaanites out of the land, but lived alongside them. Breaking away from the covenant of Sinai, they began worshiping the Baal and the Ashtaroth on weekdays and kept the worship of Yahweh for the Sabbath. Said, let's figure this out. We need the gods of this land because Yahweh apparently is not the God of the land. He's the God of the mountain. We saw him on Mount Sinai. He is not the God of the fertility of the land. This is not him. That's how they thought about it. So let's combine both of them. Weekdays, we worship Baal. Weekends, we worship Yahweh. And then you hear later in the book of Kings, Elijah screaming from the top of his head saying, until when you're going to be dancing between the two parties? If Yahweh is the Lord, then worship him. If Baal is the Lord, then worship him. Don't keep jumping from one side to another. Weekdays, weekends, and today we do the same. We worship the world on weekdays, and we come on the church on the weekend and worship our true God. So they were oppressed. When this happened, they broke the covenant with God. They were oppressed by their enemies and suffered persecution. And when they returned to God and cried for his help, God sent the judges. Here comes the judges. The judges were heroic military deliverers for about 300 years, until the united monarchy was established under King Saul. The book of Judges describes cycles of sin, the rising of enemies, and I mean by sin here apostasy, going and worshiping other gods. The rise of enemies, namely the Baal and the Ashtaroth. The rise of enemies who oppress Israel. They cry to God, who send them a judge to rally the people to fight, gather everybody. Each cycle ends with victory and a period of peace. And then they go back into the same habits, and they go into the oppression. They cry, God send them a judge, and the judge delivers them. They take a period of peace, they go again. How many times? 7 cycles. 7 cycles they go through this over 300 years. The book was attributed to Samuel as its author. The reason of writing of the book was to justify the rise of the monarchy. Samuel wrote this book as a historical book to tell you why we needed a king. How do I know that? How do I know that from the book of Judges? That whoever wrote that book, and traditionally we know it is Samuel, why did he write it? The theme of the book can be found in the verse. This is the verse. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. This has happened over and over again. Every time this verse was written, it was followed by a terrible event, or terrible events. Terrible events. The reference to the absence of the king was made 3 more times. In those days, there was no king in Israel. And it came to pass in those days when there was no king in Israel, that where there was a certain Levite staying in the remote mountains of Ephraim. This is the beginning of the most horrible story in the whole Bible from beginning to end. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. So this verse keeps repeating. What does it mean? That every time I tell you there is a horrible event is going to happen, I remind you there was no king then. That means I'm trying to prepare you to understand why we need a king. The cycles were not written chronologically, but divided geographically: north, south, center, and west. I want to make a point about Samson, because he's a Nazarite, and we spoke about Nazarites before. The strength of Samson was in his Nazarite vow. He belonged to the priests who at the beginning of the conquest carried the Ark of the Covenant and led Israel to victory in Jericho. The priests, don't just think of the priest as ritual people who does rituals in a church or in the tabernacle. They're actually the strength of the people. They're the strength of the people. So Samson, being a Nazarite belonging to the priest, he was given that strength, like in the time of Jericho. So he was himself a fortress, some very strong power. And this, I want you to look at this, and I did it so that I don't have to write the events. It's all grouped in this map if you want to think about it. They're written in numbers. So the numbers at the beginning of the box tells you who happened first and who happened second and who happened third. Not time-wise. It is how it is written in the book of Judges. By the way, the book of Judges, like I said, is not written as a timeline. It's written with geographical events. So you might have something written at the end of the book, might be the first incident in time. So don't look at the order as an order of time. So let us go and follow this with the chapters. The first story was given to us in the book of Judges is the story of Othniel, the first judge. He defeated the Canaanites at the Beer, that's up in the north by the Sea of Galilee. And he delivered Israel from Cushan Rishathaim, king of Mesopotamia, in a separate battle, and we don't know exactly where. It's something in the north. That's in chapter what? Judges 1 and 3. 2, we have in the south, Ehud, a great-grandson of Benjamin, delivered Israel from the oppression by King Eglon of Moab. He did it single-handedly in chapter 3. And it's a very interesting story of how he went through the palace guards and all kinds of things, and he has a sword in his clothing that nobody saw, and then he killed that king who was oppressing Israel. This is the second story of Judges in chapter 3. Number 3, Shamgar, and again in the south or the west, a relatively minor judge who killed 600 men with an ox goad, delivered Israel from the Philistines, again in chapter 3 and also in chapter 5. 4, Deborah, and you will hear about her, she's most famous. Deborah, a woman judge, also called a prophetess, and Barak, her military commander, she used Barak and she strengthened him and encouraged him so he can actually do this very decisive battle in the north. Subdued the stubborn Canaanites led by Jabin and Sisera in a fierce battle at Kishon River. She has a very beautiful song, and people say this is the oldest song in the Bible. A very beautiful song, and I think it inspired movies like The Lord of the Rings about the river rising up and helping the good people fighting evil. The river Kishon, and she described him as rising up. Apparently there was a lot of rain and the river flooded, and the chariots of the Canaanites, they were very advanced military. They couldn't drive them because it became muddy. And this is chapter 4. Number 5, Gideon, one of my favorite persons in the Bible, in the Old Testament. A mighty man of valor. The angel came and met him by a wine press underground. And he was doing what? He was actually threshing wheat. You don't thresh wheat underground. You thresh wheat on top of the ground, so the wind, a little breeze will come and help you separate the kernels from the chaff. But he was going underground because at the time the Midianites used to wait for people to finish threshing, and they take the wheat or burn it, and they used to oppress them very much. So when the angel came and saw him doing this frustrating business of threshing wheat or barley underground, and Gideon has no one to help him, it's a very frustrating business. So the angel said to him, "The Lord is with you, mighty man of valor." And Gideon answered the angel and said, "Tell me, if the Lord is with us, why is this happening to us?" And this is a question that keeps repeating all the time. When people go through hard times and they don't understand why they are going through this hard time, while God is promising to be with us, they ask the same question. If the Lord is with us, why is this happening to us? So Gideon asks for signs, and the angel tell him, "Go and use this feistiness, your anger, not against me. Go use it against the Midianites, and God will be with you." And he said, "How would I know that?" And he asked for 4 signs, and God gave him 4 signs. The last of them was the dream of the Midianite soldiers of Gideon. That's number 5 in Judges 6-8. Number 6, Jephthah, one of the most tragic stories in the Bible. He's a son of a harlot, delivered Israel from the Ammonites in Judges 11 and 12. He is the one, before he went to war, vowed a rash vow, one of the rash vows, to offer to God as a burnt offering the first alive thing that comes out of his house. When he went back from the war victorious, and he had to fulfill his vow, and the first living thing that came out of his house was his own daughter. And he fulfilled what he vowed, and the daughter asked him for a month to cry and to mourn that she's going to go and die a virgin and not have children or a family. So this was Jephthah in chapter 11 and 12. And it's a story to teach us not to be very quick in making vows. Number 7. And number 7 is Samson. He's the last of the judges in this book. A man of great physical strength, but moral weakness, led Israel for 20 years. And Samson was a Nazarite, belonged to the priest. His power was in his own consecration, the vow that he had, that was made for him by his parents. He was captured by the Philistines through a woman who pushed him until he told her the secret of his power that only Israel understood. The Israelites understood his power, where it's coming from, because of his consecration as a Nazarite. But the Philistines didn't. They don't understand it. So when he gave the secret, by the way, it's something very important. So he was in sin. He was living in sin. But yet his vow was kept. His vow was kept. But then when he abandoned his vow and gave the secret of his vow, all his power was gone. And maybe that was the best thing to happen to him, so that he can return to himself. Samson called on God and prevailed over the enemy. When he destroyed the pagan temple in this city, Samson died with many of the Philistines when the building collapsed. That's Judges 13-16. These are the judges, and they are divided by chapters, and I think it's a good map so that you understand where each of them was, and where they belong in the Bible too from the chapters. Okay? Now we move to, before we go over to, I want to just say something about the book of Judges. At the end of the book of Judges, you have the tribe of Benjamin completely lost. We get in a period where even judges are not existent. We don't hear anything about them. But the tribe was protective of one town who completely turned into violence and sexual immorality, to the extent of demanding to have a man to lay with a man, and as it happened in Sodom and Gomorrah. It was more violence than sexuality. It's more a crime of violence. So they took the man, and they wanted to have the man, and the man said, take my concubine, and they killed the concubine, doing whatever they pleased with her, abused her the whole night, and she died. So the man, the Levite, took that dead body, cut it into 12 pieces, sent it everywhere to the tribes, and they gather together. They make a fight against the Benjaminites, and they completely killed all the men of Benjamin except 200. And then when they found that they're almost kind of annihilating the tribe, they said, stop, we don't want to kill everybody. Let those 200 hide. We are not going to go after them. They hid. And then later, they made a trick to get them to have wives and to restart the tribe of Benjamin. Yes? That is because we think of this today also. Because it is not for him. That vow is not his personal commitment to God. So let us say today there's a deacon or a priest who lives in sin. Does that cancel his priesthood? It doesn't. When the people, they might be scandalized. They say, what am I taking from the priest? Is this the body of Christ? This was actually happened on history. Is it still the body of Christ? Yes, it is. It doesn't really cancel his dedication. Unless the church says, you're no more, you're canceled. But as long as, and he doesn't really get reordained again if he's reinstated. So that doesn't cancel the gift. But what cancels the gift is that he will be defrocked, and by him cutting his hair, he ended his time of consecration. It's finished. So he became a very regular person. So I hope that we understand this. Is the difference between the personal accountability of the servant and his service as a gift, his office. Now we move to the next book, which is Ruth. It's 4 chapters, and I want to just make sure that we write here it is 16 chapters. Is it? 16, right? Huh? 21? Okay. But the Judges ends by the 16 with Samson. Then it starts the bad events at the end. Okay, let's go to Ruth. The book of Ruth is a sweet book, a very beautiful, very sentimental, but it focuses on the covenant as a relationship. So this book actually describes the ancestry of David. The book of Ruth is the story of Ruth, as the book says. And it's a very sentimental book because it has to do a lot with the converts into Judaism. They used to celebrate the consecration of the converts, somebody converted from any other religion to Judaism by Pentecost. And Pentecost is the book when they read that book. Ruth is written by Samuel. Again, here's something I'm trying to fight. If I should tell you, this might take a little bit of time. It said the book of Judges actually is a bad light for which tribe? It gives a very bad light on which tribe that I ended the book with this very bad story. The tribe of Benjamin. Who is from the tribe of Benjamin? It's King Saul. So the Benjaminites ended up in a very bad state in the book of Judges. And this book is talking about Ruth, who's going to be the grandmother of King David. So one book says Saul comes from an evil ancestry, and the other book says that David comes from a very good ancestry. It's a very interesting way to look at it. So the book of Ruth was written by Samuel, who is the same person who anointed Saul and David. So in a way, he's trying to justify in the book of Judges, why did I bring a king? And the second thing he's trying to justify, why did I anoint another line, not Saul? You can think of it this way. The book of Ruth was written by Samuel, the prophet. It's a simple story that happened during the time of the Judges. This is exactly at the same time where the people were actually going very bad. The book highlights several themes. And the story you all know. This was a woman from the tribe of Judah. Her name is Naomi, and she had a husband and 2 sons. A famine happens in Judea, and they have no food. They lose their land by putting it out for money. They give the land and they give it to someone rich. He gives them money to live by. The money is finished, and they lost the land. They don't know how they're going to bring the land back or redeem it. So what do? The man takes his wife and 2 sons and immigrate to the land of Moab. Apparently, Moab had more agreeable time or economy than Judea at the time. So they lived there. The 2 sons are married to 2 Moabite girls, Ruth and Orpah. The man and the 2 sons, Kilion and Mahlon, the 3 men died. So they have 3 widows, a mother-in-law and 2 daughters-in-law. The mother-in-law says, "You're still young, my daughters." She called them daughters. "So go back to your families, find yourself a husband, and continue your life." And they both first said, "No, we will stay with you. We cannot leave you. You are our mother now. We left our families, etc." And then she insisted. She pushed a little bit, so Orpah left. Ruth stayed with her. And then Ruth stayed with Naomi. Naomi said, "I have no children to give you. And if I hope to get married and have a child, will you wait until that child becomes a man and you marry him? You will be too old. Go, my daughter, find yourself a husband. Go live with your family as you were before." Ruth insisted to stay with her mother-in-law. This is a theme of what we call fidelity or faithfulness or loving kindness. And this is the theme of the Jewish word, chesed or hesed. What does hesed mean? It's exactly that, loving kindness, loyalty, all these feelings that you think about when you read the story of Ruth. So Ruth showed loyalty to her mother-in-law much more in a stark contrast with the Jewish people, the Israelites, the whole tribes, living under the judges. Because what we saw with the people doing in Judges, were they loyal to God? No. They were looking for how to cultivate the land. Well, whoever God is going to make us this prosperous, we'll go with him. Today you have the same thing. People don't care about what God would feel. They don't care about God's feeling. We'll do what makes us get better. That's it. So by doing this, they broke their loyalty to God. While here is a person who is not a Jew, she's not an Israelite, she's a Moabite. Who are the Moabites? We just saw them in the last chapter. They were the people that enticed Israel to do what? Remember when Balaam could not curse the people, what did he advise Balak to do? To do it through the girls of the temples of Baal. But you have here a Moabite girl who was more faithful and more loyal than the Israelites in her time. So this is a very big contrast that Samuel is putting. He's saying David comes from the best lines. He comes from the best ancestors. So loving kindness or kindness that Ruth had for Naomi, and Naomi also for Ruth, because she took her in and treated her like her own daughter, and she wanted to give her everything. The kindness of Boaz to both women, when they come back as poor women, and they live in Bethlehem, that's their hometown. Bethlehem is the town of David and the city where Jesus will be belonging. So they live in the city as peasants. They live on begging. So there is a Mosaic commandment. When the time of harvest comes, do not really clean and wipe clean your fields. What should you do? Leave the corners. Leave a little bit, so the poor people of your town can come and pick for themselves. So Boaz said to his servants, don't just leave the corners, also intentionally throw something on the floor, on the ground of the field, so that the poor people can come and take it. So they found this woman this lady who seems like a stranger. They know the face. She's not from Israel. Coming after them and gleaning, picking up. So he asks. He sits on like a stone or something by the field, watching the people harvesting, and he's supervising the work. By the way, in the time of the harvest, the owner of the field make a festival. They go out and make a tent, and they sit out in the field in the open. It's beautiful time, it's springtime. There's no rain, and they sit there and they enjoy themselves. They eat and they drink, and they make festivals, and they say stories, and they sing songs, and they dance. It's a very, very joyful time because they're happy with the harvest. So he's watching and see this girl going after his servants, and she's gleaning. Who is this girl? He said, oh, this is the girl from Moab that came with Naomi. Oh, Naomi. Naomi is my second removed cousin. She came back? Yeah. Oh, she seems, and they started telling him stories about Ruth and how she was faithful and how she stuck with her mother-in-law. She didn't want to leave her. So he moved with kindness, with loving kindness toward Naomi and toward Ruth, and started to be very generous with them. He was an older man, but we know from his ancestry, look at this. The ancestry is on the right. He comes from the line of Judah. I debated whether I should put Judah to Salmon or not. Maybe I'll put it later. Salmon is the husband of Rahab. So you understand. And he is the father of Boaz. Now, it seems like Boaz was an old man, didn't get married quickly because his mother was a harlot or a foreigner, that nobody really esteemed him high because he's not from the tribes, purely from the tribes, and his mother is not, a very prestigious woman. So he was left to be single, but he was a good man. His mother was a believer, a convert, and apparently he was a very good and kind man. The second theme that we see in the book of Ruth is the work of the Redeemer, and the name for the Redeemer in Jewish is Goel. In redeeming back the land of Naomi and marrying Ruth. In the law of Moses, when a man dies and have no children, his next of kin, it might be his brother, might be his cousin, might be his uncle, whatever it is, he would marry the wife of the deceased man and redeem the land if he can have the money, and then give the land to the children that they will carry the name of the deceased father. So this is the work of the Redeemer. So this is the work of Redeemer here means the one that takes back, bring back. And Boaz is a symbol or a type of Christ who brought us back to God, who bought us back to God, who had the money, his blood, to buy us back, to bring us back. That's the goal, the Redeemer. They call it in Hebrew, if the redemption is about the blood, they call it Goel Haddam, means the Redeemer of blood. If someone is killed and they have to have somebody to go after the murderer to kill him. But in this case was the land and the line. The third theme, God turned the circumstances of Israel from famine to abundance, and of Naomi from depravity to fullness. The first precede the latter, meaning the famine starts with this. The book starts with the famine, ends with the harvest, starts with the tragedy in the life of Naomi, and ends with Naomi having a baby from Ruth. But the natural correction happens before the personal one. The nature first recovers from the famine, and then Naomi brings in the recovery of Naomi too. The book tells of the story of King David ancestry, like we see here. And I'm going to ask you this in the questions to tell me the order of things. So Salmon is the father of Boaz from Rahab. Boaz marries Ruth. He gets a child. His name is Obed. Obed is the father of Jesse, and Jesse is the father of King David. Very simple, straightforward. Salmon, like the fish. Boaz is the husband, the Redeemer. Obed is the son. Jesse is the grandchild, and David is the king. This is the ancestry of King David. Very sweet story. It's one of the 5 scrolls. They call them the Megillot. And the Megillot is 5 books used for feasts or occasions in the Jewish synagogue. And this book specially is read around Pentecost. Why they read it around Pentecost? Because they said that King David was born in the Feast of Pentecost. And not only that, that the Israelites received the Torah when Moses came down from the mountain on Pentecost. So they say this is the best feast for the converts. And Ruth becomes the best example of a convert because she came to Judaism with her whole heart. Right? Now, we move to the beginning of the monarchy. There are two books in the Jewish Torah, in the Jewish Tanakh, the book of the Bible, the Bible of the Jewish people. It is one book. First and Second Samuel are not two books, one book. It is made in the Septuagint into two books for purpose of so you don't have that big, huge scroll of book. You cut it into two. It is 31 chapters. It's narrative. The book of First Samuel was written by Samuel the prophet and maybe other prophets. It tells the transition from the rule of the judges, like we said, why the judges had to arise, and to the monarchy, to the king. The book can be divided into three parts, simple parts. So 31 chapters, 3 parts. The first one is the story of Samuel himself, chapter 1 to 7. And the second part is the story of Saul. And the third part is the story of Saul and David together. So when you talk about the account of Samuel, it's 1 to 7. The account of Saul is 8 to 15. The account of David is 15, David and Saul, 15 to 31. Second Samuel will be completely dedicated to David. So you have an overlap from 15 to 31 between David and Saul. What happened in the account of Samuel? Samuel is the only person in the Bible who's in the Old Testament I'm talking, not the New Testament, I'm sorry, the Old Testament, whose story, whose narrative begins before his birth. For a little bit is Isaac too, before I forget, and maybe Ishmael for the naming, but otherwise Samuel's story begins in chapter 1 with the story of his mother, Hannah. She was barren. She made a vow. She promised God to give him as a Nazirite whatever comes out of her womb, either a boy or a girl. And the high priest gave her a promise. She took the words from the mouth of the high priest as the promise of God. And she already immediately changed her her countenance. She ate, she drank, she was crying, she started to be joyful. It's exactly what Abraham had done when God showed him the stars. Likewise, Hannah did the same. When she heard the high priest says, whatever you ask of the Lord, he will give you. You will have it. And in 1 year time, she brought a child and she called him Samuel. In chapter 2, you have her prayer, a beautiful prayer modeled like the prayer of St. Mary in Luke 1. Eli and his son condition in chapter 2 and her prayer too. So they were actually the high priest and his priest, the sons. They were in very miserable shape. In chapter 3 is the calling of Samuel. God speaks to Samuel. Samuel, you know the story. Chapter 4, whatever God said to Samuel in chapter 3 is fulfilled in chapter 4. And the ark gets taken and the land of the Philistines. And the ark moves from one city of the Philistines to another. And I have this little map here to show you. This is Jerusalem. It's not far. And it's Ekron, Gath, where Goliath is from, Ashdod, Ashkelon, and Gaza. These are the 5 cities of the Philistines that the ark will move from one city to another. Every time the ark goes to a city, the Philistines get sick. Big time. The ark of the covenant sickened them. Big time. And one of the times they offered the ark, the first time they entered him into their God's house, the temple of their idol, Dagon. And Dagon is a man's torso, and the lower part is a fish. And he is the Near Eastern god of grain. He's adopted by the Philistines. That's not their original god. They adopted him from somewhere else. So they used to place their trophies in the sanctuary. It's very common. So in chapter 5, they bring the Ark of the Covenant and put it there in the house of Dagon. And the Dagon, actually, in the next morning, they found him face down with his arms cut. Every time they bring him up and they blaster him, you will find him back on his face, broken. In chapter 7, the ark could not stay anymore because they got sick in every city, and people didn't want him. The people of the cities would say, don't bring him to our city, we don't want the ark. So they make a very interesting thing. They get 2 cows who are milking cows. They have calves, babies, and they take their babies, and they tie the 2 cows to a cart, and they put the ark on the cart, and they see, usually cows will not leave their calves behind. What happened is, they said, if the cows leave this land of the Philistines and go toward the land of the Israelites, and leave their calves behind, then we know it is the God of Israel who did this to us, all this sickness and all this breaking and all this destruction. If they don't leave, and they act like normal cows, we know it is just something that happened by chance for us. It's our bad luck. The 1 Samuel in chapter 7 describes to us that the 2 cows started to low, that's the voice of the lowing of the cows, loudly. And they kept walking straight toward the land of Israel. Why they were lowing, the Bible would say, and the commentaries would say, they were in distress. They're leaving their kids behind, but they cannot help it. They have to move forward. When they reach Jerusalem, the people get so excited about the return of the ark, and they start offering sacrifices. Chapter 7 is the Samuel narrative about the events in his time. So that's 1 to 7. Then in chapter 7, in chapter 8, people start to ask for a king. Enough, enough, enough. We don't want any more judges. The last judge in this, so first judge is Joshua. The last judge is, I'm going to ask you about this. The first judge is Joshua himself. When the last judge will be Samuel and his children. That's the last judge. Then we move into the king. So they asked for a king, and someone said, why? What did I do? And God said, go make them a king. Don't complain. They are not, if they are complaining about anybody, not about you, it's about me. Saul, in the same time, was a young man, very handsome, tall man, very big. You say this is one of the tallest people in Israel. From his shoulder up, taller than anybody in Israel. Was looking for the donkeys, the female donkeys specifically, of his father who ran away from the house. When he was looking for them, his servant said, we have a vizier, somebody who can tell us where they are. He's gifted. He's talking about Samuel. So he's asking, and they said, do we have anything to give to this man? And the servant says, I don't know, let me look. And he looked for himself and found like a very tiny, like 2 grams of silver. Something that you can't really think about it as anything. And they said, the commentator would say, if he didn't have this, he would have never seen Samuel. They would cancel the whole project. So between the donkeys running away, between this piece of silver, Saul was made anointed a king. The first war of Saul after being anointed a king in chapter 10 was for a city. And it is the people of Gibeah. And the people of Gibeah will always remember that he came to their aid. And we took this in the study. What was the name of the king? And I said the name of the king was very important. His name was Nahash. And we said Nahash was the name given to the devil, the serpent in the garden. So he made the war and saved the people of Gibeah, who Nahash wanted to humiliate. Then in chapter 12, Samuel is forced to transfer the leadership from himself as there was a confederate of tribes, and Samuel was the leader of that confederate. He transferred the leadership from himself to Saul as the king. Then Saul fight against the Philistines, and then he doesn't wait for Samuel. Remember, Samuel is from Ephraim, his father, but because he's a Nazarite, he's a priest. He told him, don't sacrifice anything until I come. Saul doesn't wait for him. And when Samuel says, why did you do that? Why did you do a sacrifice? You're a king, you're not a priest. He said, because I was afraid the army that I collected started to scatter, and they got bored, and tired of waiting, so I had to do it so that they don't leave me. And Samuel was very angry with him. The second fight against the Philistine and his vow, in that vow he said nobody should eat anything until we defeat them. Jonathan, his son, didn't hear of the vow, and he takes a piece of wild honey and he eats it and give him strength to fight. And in this chapter we see Jonathan doing something very beautiful. He said, well, let us go and fight the Philistines even single-handed with his arm bearer. And they do, and they get a victory that day by doing this. And he said this beautiful verse, God has no problem in conquering with few or with much. Saul fight against Amalek, and this is the second fatal disobedience. And then in this time, God told him through Samuel, don't keep anybody alive. No animals, no people. And he said, when the fight is finished, and God gave him the fight, he had victory, he kept the king, Agag. That's the title of the king of Amalek, Agag. And then he also kept some animals. Then Samuel said, what did you do? Why didn't you listen? He said, because I thought to keep some for sacrifices. And the beautiful verse in this, it says, do you think God is delighted in sacrifices or more in obedience? To listen is better than sacrifices, and obedience is better than the fat of rams. And to be disobedient is worse than worshiping idols. And then in that time he tore the clothes of Samuel when he's trying to keep him, and Samuel is trying to leave. Forcibly they tore the clothes, and Samuel looked at him and said, God will tear the kingdom from you as you tore my clothing. This is the second fatal disobedience. Now we start chapter 16, the third part of 1 Samuel. David, now God was displeased with Saul, and he said to Samuel, go anoint me another king. I'm not excited about Saul. Chapter 16, Samuel takes the flask of oil, the anointing oil, and goes to consecrate David. And he goes to Bethlehem to do that. In chapter 17, Goliath appears in the picture, and you have the famous story of David and Goliath. And here's my question. What made David very sure, what promise God gave David to be sure that he will kill the giant? And it's very simple. The promise was implied in the anointing of David. That's why the two chapters come after another. David gets anointed as a king in chapter 16. Goliath started to mistreat the Israelites in chapter 17. David takes it as God is saying to him, you will kill this giant. Go, you are the king. And this is what made this act of heroic faith, not a suicide. David, Saul, and Michal, there is an interaction between the three. Michal loved David. She's the only woman in the whole Bible from beginning to end that's said to be emotionally involved with a man, and that's chapter 18. David is covered up by Michal as Saul now is seeking to kill him after the thing and started to be very envious and jealous of David and wanted to kill him. Michal helps him to run away. David escaped to Samuel. Here you have all the Psalms now. There's a lot of Psalms written, and if I have a chance, I might be able to give you a list of what happened and what Psalm David wrote. So that's a very nice story. The Psalms are actually titled with the events. So you can link the two. David escaped to Samuel, to the prophet. Then David meets Jonathan. They make a covenant. Then David goes to the high priest. He's on the run, fleeing from Saul. He's hungry, and he has no weapons. So he goes to the high priest Ahimelech and asks him, do you have bread? He said, I have the showbread, which is not supposed to be eaten except by the priest. But if you're hungry, I'll give it to you if you are not if you're ready. The readiness meant to be consecrated. Same thing we talked about by the Mount Sinai. He said two things: that they washed their clothing and they had not had intimate relationships with their wives. And they said, we've been on the run for the last week. They give him the bread and they eat. He gave him the sword of Goliath and he leaves. Then Saul comes to ask about David, and the high priest says, I didn't know that you are in fight with David. I had no idea. Saul said, you gave him food and you gave him a sword. You're my enemy. And he asked people to kill the priest. Nobody wanted to. A foreigner came who was the one who told on David and killed the high priest, and they made a massacre that they killed all the family of that priest Ahimelech. This were the descendants of Eli, the high priest. So this massacre, I think, is the final and the most tragic thing in the time of Saul. He had done the ultimate sin. Saul started to pursue David into many places. In chapter 23, Saul pursued David to the cave at En-Gedi in chapter 24, where David actually cuts a piece from his clothing when Saul was unaware. And then David showed it to him from afar, and Saul cried. And he understood that David had the chance to kill him, and he didn't. Samuel died in chapter 25. At the same time, David encounters Nabal and Abigail. David and the Saul in the wilderness of Ziph again, and in this time David takes his cup and his spear, and he showed it to him from afar when Saul was asleep. The second time, Saul cries and repents. David says, no more, I can't trust Saul anymore. I'm going to leave. And he went to the Philistines, his enemies, and he stayed with the king of the Philistines, Achish, chapter 27. It ends in chapter 28 with the most dramatic chapter in the Bible. Saul goes to meet a necromancer, which is a person who calls the dead. And he asks to bring in the spirit of Samuel. She brings the spirit of Samuel. Samuel tells Saul that you will die tomorrow, and you and your sons, and you will come with me. Saul becomes so sick, he had not eaten anything, and he is crushed, he's broken, and the woman feeds him and comforts him, and he leaves the next day. Then David actually, at the meantime, goes to Achish and said, I'll go with you for fighting Saul. Achish said no, because his counselor said, don't trick David with us. David is going to betray us. He's the one who killed Goliath. You don't remember that? The Amalekites attack David, and David run after them and get his family back and everybody safely. Then chapter 31 ends by the death of Saul, where the Philistines actually find him injured, and he killed himself in a suicidal action. They cut his head, hang it on the door of one of the cities. The people of Gibeah, whom Saul had saved in the beginning, they an act of loyalty, come and take his head and his body, and they make a burial for him, a proper burial for a king. This ends the book of 1 Samuel. I want to make a note here, the transition from Eli to Samuel. Eli is a priest and judge. Samuel is a prophet, priest, and judge. It's very smooth. Nothing happened. The transition from Samuel to the first king, Saul, is with some difficulties. Samuel is a little bit resistant. But the transition from Saul to David is with great difficulty, bloody. Okay? So this is something to keep in mind. The book of 2 Samuel, and there's not going to be much to say about this book. It's very simple, but I want to highlight the covenant. It is the reign of King David, and it's a subject of 2 Samuel, which is composed of 3 parts. David's rise to power, then one chapter in the second part, which is his sin. It's almost like a hinge. You start very good in the first 10 chapters, and then things turn very sour, the last 13 chapters. Now, David's rise to power starts by reigning only over Judah in chapter 4, then all Israel, chapter 5, with details about how this happened. Then David brings the ark to Jerusalem. In chapter 6, the ark already had been brought back to Israel, but not in Jerusalem. Then the ark stays in the tent in Jerusalem, and while David has a palace in Jerusalem. And Jerusalem by the time was like 6-7 acres, that's all. God's covenant with David to build David's house by giving him a son, who in turn will build the house of God, that's chapter 10. Remember that David said to Nathan, the prophet, I live in a palace, and the ark is living in a tent. How is that? How does that make sense? I want to build a house for God. And Nathan, out of zeal and enthusiasm and admiration for David was a breathtaking person. You just get to admire the man. If you just see him and stay with him for a little bit, you cannot help it but love him and respect him a lot. So Nathan was very much taken by David. He told him, whatever you want, do it. The Lord is with you in everything you do. At night, God speaks to Nathan and said, did I tell you that? Why are you telling David to build me a house? Go tomorrow and tell him what I tell you. It was a bit tough with Nathan. And Nathan went the second day and said to David, the Lord is telling you, he builds your house. You're not going to build his house. But he's going to give you a son who will build God's house and will build your house. And it's a lot of play on the Hebrew words that's very, it rhymes, or very much the same, what do you call it? Not synonyms. That has the same music. So the word for a house is binah. And the word for a son is ben. So what Nathan said to him, to David, you shall not build the binah of God, but God will give you a ben, and the ben will build the binah of God and your binah. So he's talking about Solomon, but in the second and the full fulfillment, whoever is going to build the house of God is Christ, the son of David. That's when the Israelites and the Jews saw Jesus, they called him the son of David, and especially in Matthew. Chapter 11, David is in a miserable shape. He goes from this very big figure to a murderer and an adulterer, and ends up being rebuked. A child is a product of the relationship with Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah the Hittite, whom he killed by the sword of the Ammonites. And then he repents and writes a very beautiful psalm, Psalm 50 or 51 in the Hebrew, 51 in the Septuagint is 50, when he repents bitterly before God. And then things started to come against David. The ensuing troubles in the third section is because of that sin. Nathan rebuke and David's confession is chapter 12. Amnon and Tamar, the story of his firstborn, or his son Amnon, who had a crush. He didn't fall in love with the girl, who was half sister Tamar, the full sister of Absalom. And he takes the counsel of a very wicked cousin of David, or a nephew of David. His name is Jonadab, and the son of Shemaiah, who is the brother of David. So that nephew of David, the cousin of Amnon, who was very friends, the cousins were friends, told him, you can take her and rape her. I'm going to tell you the story, the plan. They made the plan, it succeeded. He forces Tamar and rape her, and then he hates her big time. Absalom hides his feelings for a year. In the time of the harvest, with the feast and the drinking, he takes advantage and kills Amnon. And then after that, he runs away, and when he came back, he started a rebellion against his father. He's holding a grudge. And then Absalom gets into, the kingdom is about to be torn from David. Absalom takes his counselors, army leaders, and becomes a king against David. And he chased David, his father, out of Jerusalem. And then you have the story of the council of Ahithophel. Here is something about Ahithophel that I think you hear about him in Vespers and Matins. Who is Ahithophel? Anybody knows? Who is this guy, Ahithophel? He was a counselor of David who sided with Absalom, his son, against him. Why did he side with him? Anybody knows? If you read the book of Chronicles, you will know. Any idea? Surprise, surprise. He's the grandfather of Bathsheba. He is the grandfather of Bathsheba. Why would he have a grudge against David and he treat him this way? Because he will never forget that David did what? Took his granddaughter and had her pregnant while her husband was at war, and then killed her husband. So Ahithophel doesn't really have any good feeling toward David. The first chance he saw that his son is rebelling against him, what did he do? He sided with. But then David prayed that God will make the counsel of Ahithophel, because Ahithophel was telling Absalom, tonight your father is running away from Jerusalem, get him. He is going to be very weary and tired. He's not a young man anymore. He's an old man. Get him now and kill him. If they did this, David would have been killed, because Ahithophel's counsel was correct. And David was praying that God will make the counsel of Ahithophel silly in the eyes of his son. And it happened. David sent another man, a good man, a very wise counselor. His name is Hushai the Archite. And he told him, talk to my son, he trusts you too. And as if you don't know me. And whatever Ahithophel says, say the opposite. And he said, no, my king, he said to Absalom, you can't do that. Ahithophel says, go today. You don't know your father. You know him. He's like a bear, a wounded bear. What happens when the bear is wounded? They become very, very violent and very aggressive. Don't do that. Wait until you gather your forces and do this and do that. So he listened to Hushai, and he thought the Ahithophel counsel was silly. When Ahithophel counsel was put down, Ahithophel killed himself because he understood this was the end of himself and also of Absalom. Absalom goes to fight against David. Then the army of David actually defeat the army of Absalom. And Absalom, although David said, don't kill him, don't touch him, the nephew of David, the head of the general of the army, Joab, said, don't listen to that. He had long hair. He was a very comely man, very charming. But he has hair, very, very big hair. They used to weigh his hair by pound. His hair got wrapped in the trees when he was like flying on his horse or whatever, got caught in a tree and he was hanging. So Joab found him hanging from his hair by the tree, and they shot him by the arrows. And they made a big pile of stones over his body. And they broke the news gently to his father. And his father, as usual, very tender-hearted. I think David was considered by some very weak. So, and it goes after that David continues to suffer these events over, and all because he had gone through this and he didn't respect God and as a king. And David's last words, which I would recommend that we all read, it's chapter 23. Beautiful words about what kind of leader would you want for your people. Very beautiful. One of the most beautiful words I think I've read about describing a leadership. And then it ends up with another catastrophe, which is the census in chapter 24. David gets a little bit obsessed with the idea, I have to count the people, I have to count the people. God said not to do that. He didn't say to make a count of them, a census. So he makes the census, and then to disturb the census, a plague started, and the people started to die. And David cried and asked God forgiveness and said, sicken me, don't sicken those sheep. I can't really tolerate that they're actually dying. And he realized that he had done a mistake. That's chapter 24. And this ends the story of David. But when we start the book of Kings next time, David is not dead yet. He is the only king that will hand the kingdom down to his son while he was alive. The rest of the kings, they would wait until they die so the kingdom can be transferred. It's the only king in the whole Bible that actually gives the kingdom. There's only one more, which is one more. It will be King Hosea and Jotham, his son. But when we come to it, we'll tell you it's a different story. It was done against his will. It's not something that he has done willingly. This one is completely willingly in his own time. Any questions? Okay. I know I'm running because we have still a lot to cover, but I'm depending on that you know the stories and that I don't have to tell you the details of all the stories. Let's say our Father. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, make us worthy, O Lord, to say thankfully, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. In Christ Jesus our Lord, for thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory now and forever. Amen. May the love of God the Father and grace of his only begotten Son, Jesus Christ, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with you. Peace be with you.